Hello and welcome to a new webcast from the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. My name is Hussein Askary. Today is Tuesday, October the 22nd. Uh, by the way, today is the opening of the BRICS summit in Russia. The BRICS, which is the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, plus the new members, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Ethiopia. Although many people say there is a question mark on Saudi Arabia. But this is very, very important, not only because it's taking place in Russia, but because this is signals a shift in the global economic, strategic, and political theater, where we have been discussing for a while the question that the global South is assuming its right place in the world and history. And in a sense, this BRICS summit is going to be historical because there will be issues discussed on shaping a new world order, some people call it, but it's really to put things back in order after it has been, displaced for many, many decades. And we see the situation now in the world is very, very tense. We have the continuing war in the West Asia, Middle East, the destruction of Gaza, now Lebanon, potential war between Israel and Iran, but also we have the whole situation in Ukraine, which many people even talk about escalating into a nuclear war, which would mean the annihilation of the human race, basically, which is very worrying. But in the last webcast, we also discussed that how important it is to have a dialogue and also the idea of peaceful coexistence among nations. But also it's very important to understand other nations, to have a dialogue of civilization so we can understand each other and avoid these conflicts and build a more peaceful world. Of course, we discussed the previous dialogue, historical dialogue between China and the West, as the Belt and Road Initiative itself originates from China, but it's also a global phenomena now. But it's very important that the West, especially Europe, the EU, and the United States find a way of understanding China and finding a way of having a constructive dialogue with China so we can help resolve all these issues in the world. Now, to discuss this matter, today I have invited dear friend, Mr. Gordon Dumoulin. He lives in China, and he recently wrote a very, very interesting article, which actually intrigued me. It's called If I Were Chinese. Of course, without much ado, I would ask Gordon to introduce himself, because you have lived and worked in China many years, but also you have a background in Europe. So please let us know a bit about you.
Yeah, thank you, Hussein, for inviting me, first of all. Glad to be here and in your room and in this online conversation. I've been living for about 15 years in Beijing now, and but I had a longer history with China. Always had a passion. My father he traveled in China since the 70s for business, and he always came back with stories, with smells in the suitcase. Of course, with toys when we were kids. And my first time in China was actually in 1994 when I did an internship in Hong Kong and then also visited Beijing and Shanghai at that time. And in 2010, I decided to move to Beijing and set up my own business, which is now running for about 15 years. And my business is mainly in Chinese herbs, medicinal herbs. And aside that, I'm consulting Western companies who want to go abroad, especially to Europe, and vice versa, Chinese companies, European companies who want to come to China. And then when I was living here, because I realized very quickly being a visitor to China is something completely different than being inside the bubble and being a participant and an active participant in the society. And that made very quickly made a profound impression, because things were different and are different in China in many ways. And that made me realize that I had to learn more. I had to study more about Chinese culture, about Chinese history, and also simply about Chinese society, how Chinese people think, and why they often think differently from people like me who were educated in the West, who were brought up in the West, because my hometown is in the Netherlands. And that was and still is, it was and still is, and it will be a very interesting journey. And most of all, like you already said, people are different and we have different kinds of civilizations. And this is very important in today's world, and especially in today's tense situation where different forces converge, as to say like this.
Yeah, very good, because this is very good because we have many people who are, some of them have not even visited China, have opinions about China. We have people who, like me, just travel in China, and they have some impressions about China, but you have a more deeper understanding of China, not only because you lived there, but because also you have certain intellectual, philosophical interests in understanding the culture, the philosophy, the history. So your insights are very, very valuable in this sense. You also, as you said, you're from Holland, and you have also background in European culture and understanding European culture, and this is very important. So you can see both cultures, both civilizations from different perspectives. So, but in your article, you reflect on a number of things. By the way, we have today, it's published on our website. Thank you for allowing us to do it. I will put the link in the description of the video. But you mentioned the fact that there's, as also we have noticed, there was a shift towards China, especially 2016, 2017, because the general perception was that we allowed China to come into the World Trade Organization. We helped China. We shipped industries into China to produce consumer goods, and that China will continue, to produce these cheap goods for us, and that was fine. But when China suddenly emerges as a major industrial power, which is not simply producing T-shirts and shoes and consumer goods for the Western world, but becoming a world leader in many aspects of industrial, technological, scientific research, suddenly things shift, because this view of a China which we can pat on the shoulder or the back and say, "Oh, thank you for producing those cheap things for us." Now suddenly you realize that China is not what the China you have believed, and therefore even people, as you mentioned in your article, that who lived and worked in China, they also suddenly woke up to the fact that this is a different China than we have experienced. So the antagonism against China comes mostly from China rising, but also becoming more self-confident, being more self-assertive rather than aggressive, as they say. So how did you see this shift taking place in China, and how is the process of change in China is affecting this view?
I think one misconception actually is that China didn't change from the heart. We believe that in the West, we believe that China changed, but China didn't change from a Western perspective, how we think about change, because China constantly changed. It has changed since 1949, since the foundation of the People's Republic. It has been in a constant change, and even before that, but that is a historical discussion. But China has been changing according to the development path. And that change has always been founded on the fact that China didn't change, because China is a civilization for a few thousand years. And this civilization, this culture has been ingrained in the minds and actually in the blood of the people.
Yeah, just to explain, because there is a paradox here that China did change, but at the same time did not change, because China has been changing economically and in many ways. But
Of course,
my
yes.
point is that there are people in the West who believe that if we allow China into the global market and this interaction to produce these goods, and with the economic development, what will happen is that China will change from a communist, autocratic regime into a liberal democracy like we want.
Yeah, and
And people are
that's the Western
disappointed that
perception.
this change, what they think will change, did not happen. So that's the discussion about change or not change.
Yeah. But that is where I was
Yeah.
coming to. I I just from because it's very important to understand the Chinese perspective, because we are talking about China and the Chinese people. Chinese people don't believe in that change what the West was expecting, or they don't see that change as such. And indeed, as you said, the West expected after China opened up in the early 90s, over in the 80s, very slowly, and then rapidly in the 90s, and then they became a member of the WTO in I believe 2001, I think. And as you already mentioned, the West expected two things, that they would gradually adapt or transform into a kind of liberal democracy, or I mean, it doesn't have to be exactly the same because you have various forms, but anyway, they would tend to the West, to a Western centric system. And that's for two reasons, that the West believed that. And the first reason is that only a Western centric system could develop an economy. It could develop an economy, a society, a rule of law, all these kind of things. That was the first belief, that could only happen in a Western-centric system to be successful. Secondly, the second misconception was about the people, that the Chinese people would demand, similar to Western people, would demand a more liberal democracy, and then talking about Western terms like freedom and more individual responsibility and such. So you have those two aspects which the West expected to happen, especially after they entered the WTO. And then in 2016, around that time, the West woke up, because yes, we have, China has been supplying shoes and cheap goods and cheap manufacture. We call those small good shops here, where you can buy everything for 1 yuan. And they are all over the place in China and now also in the West. But they woke up to the fact that China was actually upgrading to innovation, to R&D, to stepping up to higher technologies. And at that time was maybe also the slogan "Made in China 2025." That was, I think, about that time, which also woke the West up, and they say, "Hey, China is innovating. They are improving their quality, and they are also not only in the production sphere, but they are also upgrading their society. And there's infrastructure going on, but they didn't change from the Western point of view. They didn't switch to a more liberal democracy. And also, if we look at surveys, most people in China, they are content, they are satisfied with their government and their policies, how it has been developing in the past decade.
Yeah, exactly. That this is I visited China like for several years now, every now and then. I have not lived there, but I mean, you can see in it from interacting with the people, from observing the people, they are happy with what they have gotten. The Chinese people, I don't think they have been more prosperous at a time in their history. And in spite of everything being said, because the general, as you say, in the Western media, we have this portrait, and this is what is dangerous. That like China is like you have one big thing called the Communist Party, and there is you have this vague gray thing which obscure called the Chinese people, which is 1.2 billion people, and we are never told how those 1.4 billion people living, what kind of housing they have, how their life has changed, what kind of cultural activities they have, what are the schools. I mean, I've been to kindergartens in China, and it's really amazing how advanced the kindergartens are in
Yeah.
China and the care they take of children. I mean, there's cultural, scientific, playing, there's music, everything. But we are never told this, but we are being told that there is this oppressive Communist Party, and we have all those poor, um, oppressed Chinese people. And even the surveys you discuss, as you mentioned in your articles, that they say, oh, people, when they ask, like the Chinese people are among the happiest people in the world, according to surveys, but they say, well, the Chinese people answer the questions cautiously because they think the government is listening to them. So, I mean, I have had discussions with Chinese citizens, individuals, and many of them are very quiet, free in expressing their views. I have been to art exhibitions. Some of them were really critical of the rapid economic development which has taken place because they're worried about the cultural heritage. But the whole time, what we are being fed is this idea is that the Chinese people don't really exist in, if you just look at or they are just oppressed, so you don't need to know more about them. And we know very little about the details about their life. But there is also another issue you take up in your article, which actually is very interesting. This which shows the part of the disappointment, because you quote the former Singaporean Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. George Yu.
Yes,
He
and
talks
that
about
is
this
yes.
Western misconception about, and he says, quote, foreign China scholars were disappointed because they loved China so much that they wanted to change China. And when they found out China had not changed, the love turned into hatred. That cannot be the basis for love. That I love you because I can change you. That's the basis of trouble. End of quote. Now that you mentioned the fact that we have this Eurocentric or Western-centric view of the world, that everybody who is going to be anything good should be like us. But then that didn't happen. But we also have another kind of problem, which is Western-centric, Eurocentric, is this. I have looked at it myself, this question of aid to Africa. Is that because, we love you because we feel sorry for you. And therefore we are helping you. But you should never imagine that you ever be something special. There was this Swedish development expert, Hans Rosling. I mean, he had good intentions, but his views of how to develop Africa were very, very low levels. Like, he said once that if we give every African farmer a bicycle so they can take their goods to the market, we will help Africa develop. This was his view of development. But Africans, so one African diplomat told him that, because he had told her that his dream for Africa is that children in Africa will not go hungry. That was the level of his ambition. But she told him, my dream is that when my kid grows up, he will go on vacation to Europe when he has vacation. So he said, I felt ashamed because I looked at the Africans, that they're not really equal, that they have the same way of looking at the world as we do. But if you can elaborate a little bit more on this question of, I love you because I can change you, that this is have become very, very problematic, and it prevents us from understanding other cultures, because like we have in this American Palestinian author, Edward Said, he, in his book Orientalism, he points at a very basic problem, is that when the colonialists were, to entrench this idea of supremacy, they had to portray, and even in literature, British and sometimes French literature, to portray the colonized peoples as naive, as primitive, but also they're detached from history, that all the great things that happened in philosophy, science, technology, medicine in Asia, in Africa, in the Arab world, they are not in the picture. So this idea is that they are detaching, for example, China history and great civilization from the China today. And you mentioned this question of, this idea of detachment of history from the continuity of history, because in China and Asia, they look at history as a continuous process, while we abstract history and turn it into something which is far behind, which has nothing to do with reality today.
Yeah, I mean that is coming back to this love-hate relation, because that is what it is. And it's the first time, I think it's the first time in a few centuries that a non-Western country, that the West woke up to a non-Western country who they could in various ways could take an example of. But the example was so shocking that because they were not used, when you are an hegemon for centuries, you are not used anymore to be interested in someone's culture, in someone's history, in someone's civilization, philosophy, everything. I mean, that has been, erased. I mean, I was never taught in school about Chinese history, Orientalism, something mystique, something intriguing, something nice. And the example you give for Africa is exactly right. And that can also take different shapes. People love Asia for their mystique, for their what they think philosophy, but it doesn't go any deeper than yoga. But their delicious food.
It's called exotification, turning these
Yes,
countries into something exotic, but it's nothing
yes,
substantial.
it is not substantial, but it continued after 2016. It continued because they woke up to the fact that China didn't change the way the West believed it should have, and because otherwise they could not have developed like this. No, this didn't happen. But they saw many things, not only the economy, but education, healthcare, infrastructure, and many different facets of society have developed really, unprecedented almost. It's sometimes called the most rapid development in human history, and what China did in the past 4 decades. I cannot judge, I mean, different times compared to different circumstances, of course, but you would believe that the West at that time woke up and said, whoa, what happened? What's happening here? And they should, and maybe they would have developed a kind of interest in how did China do this. But again, at the contrary, and this is exactly also what you are talking about, at the contrary, they dig their feet and their shoes in the sand even more. And they say, now China is changing for the worse, I mean, you saw that, especially in the US, but also in Europe, you saw in the years after 2016, 2017, that again, and then you also talk again about the similarity with Africa. They said, look, we try to engage with China, and we try to, be good for China, but they didn't take it, And that turned out in that disengagement, what's happening today with China. Why? We only look, as the West, we only look to China. We only look outwards. We put the cause of the issue outwards and not inwards. And in that sense, like you say, that has a historical dimension. We are the yardstick. We are the example. So we don't need to question ourselves how we can improve. And this is also a cultural basis. China is busy, and many other countries, they are busy. And what are they busy? Improving themselves. And in many different ways. And this is what's happening. But the West doesn't feel anymore the need to improve themselves.
Yeah,
Yeah. Sorry.
No, not only we are not improving ourselves, we have had a process of decline in the West. I mean, in your article, you mentioned that the fact that not only that China and the global South are rising in every aspect, but we here in the West are declining because we thought this was the end of history. I mean, I was yesterday in a very interesting business meeting. There was a delegation from Shenzhen with a meeting with Swedish counterparts and, advanced technology and things. And you see the contrast is that because in China, as I was telling one of the Swedish entrepreneurs there who works in artificial intelligence, that here in the West, we believe that we have reached the limits of technological and scientific development. I said, in China, they have just started. You see all this advancement in China, all this development in every field. They think they are just starting. And that's why they have this reform and opening up process lasting forever, because they are not intending to stop improving and reforming. We thought that we have reached the limit, and therefore we are stagnating. And that stagnation, compared to the rise in China and the advancement, creates excitement and fear. And that's where the xenophobia comes in, which is part from history, that we will be invaded by the barbarians and they will take over. But this is also a problem of projection, I guess, because we see only one way. When you are powerful, you dominate, you take over. And this is what we practiced in the West. This was colonialism and imperialism. And China is no different. So why should we not fear China, if I may ask you?
No. I mean, you put that projection right. I mean, of course, when you talk about decline in Europe, and that's the relative decline because the rest is improving and developing. So but it's also a cultural aspect, like you say, and what I also write in my article, The End of History, from Fukuyama, the article, and when the Soviet Union collapsed at that time. It's a cultural distinction. China is not only beginning; China is always beginning. China is always improving, and also from a philosophical or cultural aspect. In the West, we have seen a linear approach to things, and a linear approach you can identify different dimensions. Now, linear is up or down, but we only have one way, and that's progression. The West needs progression. China thinks also that linear is either you are on the left or on the right side of the line. That means good or bad. There's not too many distinctions in between. For China, also for other East Asian and even South Asian nations, the life is about circles. It's about coming back. Things are coming back, and it's about a balance. In every circumstance, in every situation, in every life, you have negative things, positive things, yin yang, but very pragmatic. We tend in the West again to exotize, make it exotic, this yin and yang, but it's a very pragmatic way of viewing to life, and life even from family, but it goes all the way up to what's happening in the world today, and what is the purpose? The purpose today, and that's also the conflict, is the difference how the West looks to good and bad, polarization, China looks at this differently. It's a balance. It's a balance and what we have to achieve. And in every balance, in every situation, and inside those situations, there are good elements, there are bad elements, there are elements you don't like, there are elements I don't like. But we have to find that balance to move forward. And that balance is also changing again. It's also um, being rigid and being afraid of change, what's often happening in the West. But the reality, life and the world is constantly changing. So when the balance today is like this, tomorrow it can be a little different. And we have to talk. That's why constant dialogue is needed. And it's not about simply about principles of good and bad, as I said, but it's about a dialogue. And we can see this back, what I also write in my article. We should not look for uniformity. We are not all the same. We are not all the same, but we have to live together. And this is very strong in China, even in local Chinese society. But you also can see that back in the foreign policy.
Yeah, this is what brings us to this question of resolving conflicts, because I mean, I talk not only to Chinese, but people from Malaysia, from other countries in Southeast Asia, because they say we have a method of solving conflicts because we believe in diversity, but harmony within diversity. We don't believe in uniformity, that everybody have to conform to one way of doing things. And therefore, we look at issues from every different angle and try to reach some sort of, a compromise, but it's a principled compromise, not like just to avoid problems. But there's this conflict solving you mentioned in your article, that this philosophy of harmony of, opposites is very important in solving conflicts, because the world today needs that very much, because there is not only one set of values or interests. There are many different ways of looking at the same thing.
Yeah, and that is I can speak from personal experience, of course, because when I came here, once again, when you are a visitor and you come to visit or you're doing business, which I've done for many years in China before I lived here, I mean, that's one way how you can see China. But when you start living here, we often tend in the West, for example, debates, confrontations, like in universities. That's when you are a good debater and you can prove you're right, you are celebrated. You are celebrated. And that's one cultural aspect. Now, when I came here and I started my business, I didn't have too much time to realize that I had become very dependent on many different people, because here, it's not. I had a vision of my business, for example, in mind. This is how I wanted to do it. This is what I wanted to achieve. Well, this plan was out of the door within 2-3 months, because other people also have very strong minds. People also sometimes tend to people in the West tend to emphasize to think that Chinese people don't have their own mind, or they are not individualist. But they are very strong. You also mentioned this. Of course, everybody has their own minds, but the purpose is not to have your right, to achieve your right. Because first of all, you are not alone. You are a group. And in order to have a success moving forward in a positive direction, you need to harmonize and you need to find compromise. But compromise is often because you mentioned the word compromise, which is a very good example to distinguish the differences. A good compromise in China is the ultimate right. And that is the moving forward. When we find a good compromise where everybody feels at least to have a good degree of comfort, and seeing their own values and seeing their own personal developments moving forward, that is the biggest goal of achievement. And while we in the West often think from a more personal perspective, and for example, we have debates, whether it's in business or in families or in politics, there are winners and losers. And we tend to think about winners and losers. No, in China, we don't have losers. We only need to have winners. And the reality, of course, there are some bigger winners. But the next time there might be another bigger winner. But we must be all winners. Otherwise, we cannot, because the losers will disturb the success. And this is, this is a big difference in thinking. So instead of being right, the compromise is the winner.
Yeah, I think this is very important point about the winners and losers, because this comes to the Belt and Road Initiative, and in the third Belt and Road Forum last year, I and my colleague attended, where President Xi Jinping talked. He said, China can only do well when the world is doing well, and the world will be doing well even better if China is doing well. So
exactly.
There's no zero-sum game. Everybody can become a winner. As you said, some people work harder. They can be big winners, but you cannot be a loser. You cannot be left behind just because you could not compete or you are knocked down by sanctions and war. So this permeates the whole philosophy of this idea of win-win. Many people in the West think this is a tactic. There's no such a thing as win-win. There's only one winner and one loser. And I think this is one thing which we have to change about our perception of reality, because as we said, the world is changing. It's becoming more dangerous because of these both misunderstandings, but this sticking to this hegemonic idea. But I want to just read the final quote and ask for your comment on that in conclusion, because we have a serious situation, and because you say in a sense that in the next 10 years, we'll see tremendous transformation from exclusive hegemony to a new balance of powers, often referred to as a multipolar world. Former US diplomat and ambassador Chaz Freeman offers a compelling perspective characterizing this emerging order as post-hegemonic, multi-nodal world. That it's a very fascinating concept. You try to explain it, but in conclusion, you also say, without a fundamental mental shift, Western nations, particularly those in Europe, risk becoming stagnant outposts, isolated poles rather than dynamic nodes, unable to actively co-shape and contribute to an evolving world where global challenges and opportunities, balanced with respect for national interest and diverse worldviews, become central to advancing inclusive humanity. So I think you end up on a somehow positive note that there is a solution, but the solution requires us to get out of the box and look at the world from a different perspective.
Thinking out of the box, right? I mean, that is exactly what we all need to do. And it's not only about the West, and this is also about China. This is about the whole world doing this. But what's happening today, and that's the danger. You mentioned the BRICS starting in Kazan, Russia today. By the way, celebrating the India-China agreement of the resolution of the border conflict, which is
right. It was announced today. Yes.
Yeah, it was yes, already yesterday and today. I mean, that as an example should be the biggest celebration of today, October 22. Because that's peace by conflict resolution, by dialogue, by trying to harmonize the compromise, because every resolution is a compromise. But the fact now is that, and that is of course because of history and a hegemonic a mindset which has been developed by centuries of hegemony and colonialism. is that we do not need, and that has different aspects, which I bring up in my article and which we mentioned also here today. You know, I mean, the fear, the yellow peril, that's one thing. We still have a fear of something very different, you know. What might they do to us? Another one is the projection. What others could do, and that's also, you know, what Confucius said, do not do to others what others could do to you, you know.
Right.
But this projection has the West in the mind. So, and they still believe that China or other developing nations would do to them what they have done in the past. Even when China does not, and other countries do not necessarily want the West to pay for the past. That has nothing to do with today. But the mindset in the West is still there. The mindset is there. And now when they see increasingly that nations like China, but also other nations are developing, and they are, you know, they are also expecting a bigger responsibility and a bigger role in world affairs, and rightfully so, by population. They see the initiatives like BRICS, but also like SCO, like, you know, like ASEAN. ASEAN is a wonderful example, the fastest growing region at this time. You see so many, and those organizations all are diverse. They have different ideologies, they have different cultures, they have different religions, but they all work together for a common good. To have stability, to have peace. Now, the West is still, and that's why I'm writing this, you know, because it's urgent, it's very dangerous. The West is retreating in the like-minded alliances. China, you know, China's principal foreign policy is they are a non-aligned country. They will not form alliances. And we in the West tend to see that the BRICS is an alliance. It's not an alliance. Right. SCO is not an alliance.
The Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Russia-China, even the Russia-China relation is not an alliance. It's a friendship. It's a mutual relation, you know, to work on this. So this danger, if you're only going in the like-minded nations like the G7 or NATO or, you know, well, that's about it today. You are going to be distant. Like I said, you are going to be an outpost, and especially in the whole Eurasian continent. I saw a map. It was by a Spanish. He makes very nice maps, and he really cleared. He really positions Europe, if they don't change, as an outpost. And like, you know, and because we see all these, like Jess Freeman, the ambassador, says, multinodal. We see all these nodes working together, even working, you know, really working, and it's not like it's not even all under control. It's also an organic development where you have to be a participant. But if Europe, especially Europe, stands out in this as being a member of the Eurasian continent, if they do refuse to participate because of their mental mindset, then they will be the outpost. So the most important is the mindset.
Yeah, this is the, you know, the purpose of our work here in the Belt and Road Institute. We are in Sweden, and we have also other associations in other European countries, mostly in the EU countries. We call it the Europeans for the Belt and Road, is because we are concerned for our own societies here in Europe. We want our societies to prosper and develop and live in peace with the rest of the world, and we don't want to be left behind or become a museum or an outpost. Because, you know, we care about our
as a Dutch, me as well as a Dutch.
Yeah, exactly. So you are a Dutch citizen too. So we care about our countries. We want our countries and our societies to prosper and live in harmony and peace with others. That's the purpose of our work. But thank you very much, Gordon, for taking the time. I know it's a bit late now for China. No, but I really urge everybody to read Gordon's article, which will be in the description of this, and also other works, a lot of deep and thought-provoking work. So thank you very much for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you. See you in next webcast.